Good morning. I'd like to thank NIC.br for the invitation. I'm going to make my presentation in English. If you have any questions, you can ask them in Portuguese or Spanish.
All right, so I'm here to speak about 400G optics and the trends that we are seeing in the market as the industry transitions from 100G to 400G. First of all, a few words about Finisar, in case you're not familiar with the company. We are the largest manufacturer and supplier of pluggable transceivers, among other things. Pluggables are most of what we do. We're a US company founded 30 years ago, approximately 12,000 employees worldwide locations, including sales office here in Brazil, with a broad distributor base, also in Brazil and other places in the region. You either heard our name or also have used our products. We are the primary supplier to many of the system OEMs that are both prevalent in the datacom and telecom world, although in the last 5 years, both the cloud service providers as well as smaller clouds, enterprise carriers have started to purchase optics directly from us, and that's what we've been more and more involved in the end user community. So let's talk about the topic 400G and the transition from a 25G 100G model to a 400G connections between switches. Within the data center racks, we are obviously seeing the deployment of 25G accelerating, especially in the large clouds. And the next step would be to go to either 50G or 100G, although certainly 100G to the server is what today is causing most of the interest in the early plans for deployments for next generation server interfaces. If we look at connections between data center racks, between switches, 100G has been finally started to be deployed in the last year and a half in very large volumes, driven by QSFP28. So 400G will be the next step, and that is driven obviously by the large cloud service providers. And then long spans, or DCI, where 100G and 200G coherent interfaces, and certainly NIC.br talked about that, those deployments earlier today. The next step will be 400G connections between data centers, and then presumably 600G or even 800G after that. So I'm going to touch on a little bit of different trends in many of these areas of data center networking. First, a few words on what the analysts are saying. Deloro in particular, this is Ethernet ports, not specifically optical transceivers, but there's certainly a correlation. So this is port shipments in switches in millions of units. If you see 2018 there's still a lot of 10G being deployed, being shipped, although that's certainly decreasing in the next 5 years. We're seeing the majority of the volume still being driven by 100G and 200G. That 200G could either be 200G max or maybe dual 100G. So high density 100G is part of those port counts. And then 400G, you can see at the top there, starting to be taking numbers, showing numbers, 2020 and moving forward. If we zoom in that 400G deployment data, their predictions is that large clouds, the top 4 cloud service providers will certainly drive the volume the next 5 years. Will the rest of the cloud world, VIII in China and other places driven there starting to appear there in the green bar, and then large enterprises starting to make some indent there in 2021 and 2022. So again, this is Deloro forecasting Ethernet port shipments at the switch level. So this is driven obviously in the physical domain, driven by the transition of high port count switches that today have 32 ports of 100G with QSFP28 ports. And that again is finally being deployed in very large volume in the last, I would say, year and a half by those large cloud service providers. And that will continue for a while, of course. We're only getting started with 100G. But 400G is the transition being planned for the 2019-2020 timeframe to begin. So that transition is to a 32 port model now at 400G. And we'll discuss what those transceiver form factors will look like that will enable those kinds of port densities and also the thermal management challenges that they will ensue, given the large port count. And again, this is a 12.8 terabit switch from a 3.2 terabit switch today. There's a lot of questions about the switch shown there in the middle, which is a 200G switch. And that is an evolving market, I would say. If you were looking maybe 6 months to a year ago, there was little interest in the market, except privately. Some people were still considering 200G. Today, it is more publicly known that one or two of the largest clouds out there are seriously considering deploying 200G ports. And they do that for various reasons that I'm not going to discuss here. But we can foresee also some market in the 200G space will exist. But again, we're here to discuss 400G in particular. If we look at the standardization that has been going on now for 2 to 3 years, the first standard was ratified a few months ago. That was 802.3bs by IEEE. And as you can see, it is heavily weighted towards single mode. There was one multi-mode interface that is not expected to be deployed, but we have 3 duplex single mode interfaces. One is actually a parallel single mode, DR4, for 500 meters interfaces, using both point-to-points, but also in breakout applications to servers. And then we have 2 duplex interfaces. One is a subset of the other. It's a 10-kilometer and a 2-kilometer interface, which would be equivalent to LR4 and CWDM4 in the 100G space, but now running at 400G. And again, these are all first-generation interfaces. So as you can see, they run on 8 wavelengths, running at 50 gigabit per second each using PAM4 modulation. A few more words about that coming up. There's also some additional interfaces being already standardized. Actually, CD, 802.3 CD, the work was completed last week. And that includes not only 200G, but also a couple of 100G, next generation 100G interfaces, which have a lower number of wavelengths instead of 4 by 25. CD has standardized a multi-mode interface running at 2 by 50, and more importantly, a single wavelength 100G PAM4 running on a duplex circuit for 500 meters. And this is actually important because it can interconnect with DR4. So a DR4 interface, parallel interface, can be broken out into 4 100G DRs, which is one of the models for server deployment, among other things. We're starting to see some work also in the MSA front to complement the work by IEEE. So 100G FR4, which is a duplex single mode, but now running at 100G per channel. 4 channels running at 100G PAM4. It's also being defined in this case by an MSA, and it's also gathering certain market interest, as well as a couple of other 100G single lambda interfaces complementary to these. Now, why is the industry doing this? Why an additional 2-kilometer interface? The reason is expectations of long-term cost. A lower number of lasers is always cheaper. So 4 lasers will be cheaper than 8. Maybe not initially. It is a more complex product. Implementation challenges from the thermal and performance and noise point of view. 100G PAM4 is certainly more difficult than the 50G PAM4, but ultimately that's what the primary interface that will be deployed would all be 4 channels. And last but not least, there is more recent work that started to happen recently, a different task force, focused on multimode. So this is multi-mode for specific cloud deployments. It's multiple channels, as you can see. One is a 16-fiber interface. The other one is an 8-fiber interface for some Tor to Leaf architectures, primarily coming from the cloud market in China. So just a brief tutorial. Those of you not familiar with the more physical interfaces layer. NRZ versus PAM4, we mentioned that a lot. PAM4 basically means 4-level signaling. So instead of a 1, 0, which is also called NRZ, 1s and 0s, now PAM4 has 4 different levels, which allows the transmission of 2 bits per symbol, or half the baud rate per bit rate, Although, of course, the trade-off is noise, right? You always have a trade-off, and that trade-off is the signals are harder to detect. As you can see, all of these new interfaces are PAM4, only one is NRZ, and again, this is not expected to be deployed. It's a very large fiber count, 32 fiber interface. One last point on standards. We are big believers in SWDM or short WDM, which I'm not going to talk about today. The SWDM would enable, we believe, 400G multi-mode duplex interfaces, which we think will be very valuable for enterprise deployments. But that will be the next generation, after cloud, after hyperscale cloud, I would say. Enterprise will certainly be interested in a duplex multi-mode in the future, which will be enabled by multiple wavelengths in the 850 nanometer space. The technologies expected to be used in these interfaces are VCSELs for short reach, silicon photonics for anything under 1 kilometer, and then traditional DFB, DML, EML lasers, kind of like what today is being deployed at 100G for anything under 40 kilometers. And I will talk about longer distance in a little while. So if we see how those will be deployed, and again, it's very hard to generalize a single architecture. Every cloud service provider has a different twist on the way they deploy. Text in blue is what's being deployed today, more or less, so 25G to server, including multi-mode, active optical cables, and DACs up to 3 meters in the rack. Then multi-mode active optical cables to the tier 1 switch or the leaf switch, and then single mode PSM4, CWDM4. If we look at the transition to the next generation switch, we see a similar model, perhaps not too much copper. When we go into 50G or 100G to the server, certainly copper will have a much harder time to get to any meaningful distance due to physical limitations in the media. We expect to see, again, multi-mode, combination of multi-mode and single mode, depending on which cloud provider we're talking about, towards to tier 1, and then tier 1 and above is going to be primarily single mode. Again, FR8, FR4, DR4, as well as coherent and things like ER8. ER8 is a 40-kilometer interface that is starting to be standardized at the IEEE. So a very similar deployment model if you look at it. We foresee a more preponderance of optics in the racks, given the distance limitations of copper in such high-speed interfaces to the server. If we look at the form factors, the physical implementation of the PMDs, of the optical interfaces, we are already seeing CFP8 in the market. This is primarily being used in core routers. And this is, as you may recall, early deployments of 100G used CFP or CFP2. This is a similar module to a CFP2 called CFP8, which again you will see in some of the core routers for 100G. However, the interfaces or the form factors being primarily driven for data center are smaller, obviously. Our second generation 400G with lower power, and there are things like QSFP-DD and OSFP. These two form factors, one is smaller than the other. QSFP-DD is basically like a QSFP, but slightly larger, slightly longer. An OSFP is somewhat larger than that, with some benefits in thermal management and signal integrity. However, the majority of the market that we're seeing today is pushing towards QSFP-DD. Certainly, companies like Cisco and Juniper they are publicly pushing for that in the MSA and the interoperability testing being done publicly, while Arista and also Google are the two companies that more publicly endorse OSFP as a less attractive but more realistic and lower risk form factor. We will expect to participate in both. We're agnostic. We can certainly implement our technologies in any of the form factors. So there's a lot of, these are our recent finisher demos, although there are certainly similar demos by other companies. These are a couple of optical shows that happened in 2018 in the US. This is OFC and ECOC. Certainly saw a very large variety of different optical interfaces, not only 400G, but also 200G and even single wavelengths, 100G, that were being demonstrated. Finisar was by no means the only one. There are many other vendors doing this, including in semi or public settings like interoperability demos being done by the various MSAs at these shows. So the ecosystem is very active, and there's very healthy development and investment going on in this space. Another question we get normally is, onboard optics versus pluggability. When certainly, COBO is something that the industry is following. COBO is an MSA for optics on board. There's certainly talk about co-packaging now in the industry. So, when are the optics going into the system instead of being pluggable, like we were used to for the last 20, 25 years? So, onboard optics are not new. In fact, we've been shipping onboard optics, very large volumes for many years into the supercomputing space. So it's something that has been used by the Fujitsus or the Crays and others for a while. They are not pluggable, obviously. They are mounted directly on the PCB, and they've been typically being implemented using VCSELs, so very short reach. How do you achieve higher bandwidth? You have a flexibility of either increasing the number of channels. So today, 16 channels are already being deployed using VCSELs. How you can also increase data rate, obviously. So 10G and 25G are already being deployed today, and presumably that can go into 50G PAM4 to increase throughput. However, there's drawbacks, of course. The benefits, obviously, is port density and also power. The fact that optics are closer to the ASICs on the host means that the power dissipation of those optics is lower. They need to drive lower currents to get to those chips. However, you lose the flexibility of pluggability. And so given the amount of development going on in the industry, I think it has been settled that 400G will still be pluggable. The industry is looking at not pluggable on board, maybe for 800G, maybe beyond that, 1.6 terabit perhaps. But certainly 400G, the primary, except for some specific applications in the AI space and supercomputing space, the majority of 400G networking, the vast majority, will still be pluggable and will still be a similar pay-as-you-grow model that we all have been used to, again, for the last 20 and 25 years. So if we look at the deployment, it will not be clean, right? My first slide showed, okay, transition from 25 to 100 to 400G. It will not be as clean as that. We foresee a combination of interfaces coexisting for the first several years in some of these networks, data center networks. And this kind of tries to show the complexity. It's not an easy to understand slide on purpose. So you can see, obviously QSFP28s being still deployed. You see a combination of QSFP-DDs and OSFPs in both dual 100G interfaces, in fan-out configurations to 400G and then to a 2x100 QSFP56. So there are multiple deployment interfaces and models and different varieties of optical interfaces and transceivers that are expected to be out there. And so it will be complex. What we always say is like try to stay close to the mainstream optical suppliers that essentially are not technology focused. We have access to a variety of technologies. We can implement whatever we need to do to support your needs. And also, always come to people like us and others for guidance. But it will not be if you thought 100G was complex in form factors and interfaces, this next generation of optics are expected to be even more complicated than what's going to be out there in the market. So if we look at now DCI or data center interconnect, we believe, as we said, that coherent will obviously capture the majority of that market for 80 kilometers and beyond. So that's kind of like an easy argument. What's being discussed now in the IEEE is what happens under 80 kilometers, specifically around 30 to 40 kilometer space, which is an interesting distance for some of the applications. It appears right now that direct detections may be the way to go for anything that's 40 kilometers and below for the next several years. Direct detection is essentially non-coherent, more traditional optics, things like 8x50, using PAM4 modulation, things like ER8 or even extended LR8. which is something like a 10 kilometer but goes further, 25, 30 kilometers. And like I mentioned, the standardization is going on today at both the 802.3CN task force and also the OIF 400 GCR that has written an implementation agreement for a lower cost 100 meter coherent implementation. So there's a lot of activity going on in the market today, both for direct detect and coherent. We continue to believe that aggressive innovation will be needed and will exist in coherent space to support longer reaches. So certainly when we get to 800G or 1.6 terabit, that coherent technology will take a more preponderant role in 40 kilometers, maybe even in 10 kilometers. So physically what it looks like, and this is what's happening today, right? Today at 100G, 200G, there is no optics you can plug into your switch. You have to go through a transponder box for DCI applications. There are certainly many different vendors in the market that support that, Cisco and others, obviously. Most of these boxes uses pluggable optics, coherent pluggable optics, things like CFP2 ACO. And what we foresee, what we're seeing is a evolution of the coherent driven by improvements in the optical packaging and also the DSP, bringing down the size and the power of those components to enable things like a 400G module in a CFP2 DCO. CFP2 DCO will have now a DSP inside the module. That will evolve, we believe, into a QSFP-DD as a second stage, which means essentially something roughly like the size of a QSFP that can go up to 80 kilometers, 100 kilometers, and that can plug in into your switch or your router directly. That's the difference between an ACO module or analog coherent optics and a DCO, which can be plugged in directly into a switch. So there's certainly market, not confusion, but I would say divergence today in the technologies and products available, but at 400G we see that will consolidate into these two primary modules, maybe first generation, then second generation. So how about what's coming next, right? I'm not going to talk too much about 800G, but we're already starting to think about it, both in our optical companies and also in the standards. That will be transitioning to certainly 100G into the server, but then 800G interfaces between switches, also 32 ports. It will be the assumption. And the question there will be, will pluggable be feasible? Again, will it be pluggable? Will we have to go into much denser optics that are now on the host? And the jury, I think, is still out on whether we go board mounted or also called onboard optics. And of course, if we have to go that way, this will reshape the optical business model for all of us, not only in the optical space, but you as a user will have to have completely different planning to be able to buy optics from day one in your switches and pay that cost up front. Or of course, if it's pluggable, we'll have to define form factors and so on. There's already work going on defining the electrical interfaces for these modules. That work started recently in the IEEE. It's a new task force called 802.3CK. And this CK is standardizing a 100G PAM4 electrical interface now, which has severe challenges to be implemented, but those will be ironed out, hopefully by the IEEE. Again, to enable 8-channel modules, presumably pluggable or maybe on board. So that's all I had. Again, if you have any questions, we still have a few minutes, I think, 4 minutes. Thank you very much.
Christian, posso fazer em português? Uma pergunta com relação ao...
I have a question regarding power consumption of transceivers as the speed increases. I'd like to know, you expect to have an increase in the consumption of power in the devices? They have to adapt?
Of the transceivers are expected to be significantly higher if you compare to a QSFP28. So if you look at a QSFP28 of any type, we're today around 3 watts, 3.5 watts for a single mode transceiver, to 2.5 watts for a multi-mode transceiver running at 100G. To give you an idea, this second generation or pluggable QSFPs, the single mode transceivers are expected to be around 13 watts, 13 watts, 12, 13 watts. Multi-mode transceivers are maybe around 8 to 9 watts. So it's significantly higher, and certainly these MSAs defining the module, QSFP-DD, also OSFP, are taking that into consideration. They have to essentially be able to fit that power envelope into their implementation model of 32 ports. So a very sophisticated cooling will have to be implemented by the hardware vendors. If we look at coherent, we also see an increase in power, not so much of an increase, but we expect a 400G coherent module, anything that can go maybe 80 to 100 kilometers to be around 15 watts, 1.5. Although if we move to applications supporting hundreds of kilometers, maybe 500, 600 kilometers, the expectation there is that it will be around 20 watts. So that's why you may need something larger like a CFP2 DCO instead of a QSFP-DD.
Okay, thank you.
Uma perguntinha sobre CFP2.
A question on CFP2 DCO. Finisar, do you have plans of having CFP DCO? To integrate to somebody else so that you have DSP, Finisar, or what are the plans for you?
200G, yeah. I publicly cannot comment too much about our plans, but I can tell you that we don't see a very large market for a 100G, 200G CFP2 DCO, given the fragmentation we have today at the system level. And again, I'm not gonna give you too much details about that. We see that the DCO implementation at 400G is probably a much more interesting point for the industry. So today we have CFP2 ACO transceivers, and we see that the majority of system OEMs, that's what they're using, and that's what they're supporting.
Ok. Christian, acho que não temos mais perguntas.
Christian, I don't think we don't have any more questions. I'd like to thank very much for your presence. Great report on technology updates. Thank you very much.